Hi, my name is Scott Johnston, co-founder of Uphill Athlete. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to administer and then analyze our heart rate drift test to help determine your aerobic threshold, which we'll then use to set the top of your zone 2 for all the aerobic training. I'm going to run you through a list of several bullet points on the next page, and these will help you administer the test properly and then analyze it in the end. This is a test that can be done both indoors and outdoors. Outdoors, best to do it running, and we'll get into that in a second. Indoors can be done on either on some sort of machine, like a treadmill or a stair machine. You can set the treadmill to a steep angle if you need to when you're hiking on it. Something that's vitally important is that the warm-up is 15 minutes long, or at least. It takes that long for your aerobic system to fully come online. And you need to have a fairly gradual buildup of intensity and speed. And during that warm-up, you're going to be wanting to try to find a pace and a heart rate that feels easy, and then allow your heart rate to stabilize at that whatever that easy feeling it should be. There is, and that should be at what we would call a conversational pace. In other words, you should be able to speak in full sentences, and once you've allowed your heart rate to stabilize and it's stable for 2 or 3 minutes, then you can begin the test and continue, preferably for at least 60 minutes, although you can still get good data from shorter tests, but the longer the test, the better the data will be for you. Outdoors, you're going to keep your heart rate as close as you can to that starting heart rate, and then just let the pace do whatever it needs to do. We don't really care what happens to the pace. We just want to have you try to hold that heart rate fairly close. And that's easiest to do if you're using a flat to a very gently rolling course. By gently rolling, I'll explain that when we get into examining a few tests in a couple minutes. Indoors, one of the most important things you need to do is once you establish that pace and get the heart rate stabilized, don't touch the controls on the machine. The GPS doesn't work indoors. It's important that you not change the speed, because then you won't have any record of how the speed changed, and it'll screw up the pace to heart rate ratio that we're really looking for. Once you've conducted the test and you have some data in your heart rate GPS watch, you're going to upload that to Training Peaks. Training Peaks will display the pace to heart rate decoupling or drift. Training Peaks calls it decoupling. We use the term drift. And it will display it directly. If you have a Training Peaks premium account, you'll be able to read that number directly if you're doing this test outdoors. Indoors, you'll need to do a little bit of work, and I'll walk you through how to do that in the upcoming segment of this video. The maximum allowable drift at aerobic threshold is 5%. If you're seeing a drift of 3 to 5%, use that starting heart rate as your new threshold. If not, you'll need to redo the test, and I'll talk to you about how to do that in a couple of moments. If you want more information on this, a little more background on it in detail, we do have an extensive article on this. It goes into the steps of the test and sort of the theory behind it. That's going to be linked to below this video in the description. Okay, in this next segment of the video, we're going to analyze 4 tests that were done by athletes that we train, trying to point out some of the pitfalls and successes. So this is a test one of the athletes did. You can see the date up here, May 22nd. And what happened in this test, if we look at the drift, so we can see that his heart rate begins to stabilize, somewhere in here in the mid 120s. And so let's just start the test there and drag out select about the first half. It doesn't have to be exact, but this is what it looks like, roughly the middle, somewhere in there. And you'll see over here on the right that the average heart rate is 131. If we select the second half of this test, we'll see that the average heart rate is 143. So that means that his heart rate went up by 12 beats. That's almost 10, well, just about 10% increase. So that would indicate that this was too fast. This was above his aerobic threshold, because the drift is much greater than 5%. It's 10%. So that would mean that this starting heart rate is probably too high, or the pace that he began at was too high. And then in fact, that's what it turned out to be when we spoke. He chose an arbitrary speed on the treadmill that he thought was going to be easy enough, but as you can see that the heart rate by climbing all the way, starting at 120, around 125 and climbing all the way to almost 150, clearly it was a little too fast for him to be using. We have a few weeks later, we redid this test with some more success. I want to point out something here that when you're to clarify these charts, you might want to just get rid of things like the heart rate, or excuse me, the RPM, which is the speed of the legs. We don't care about that so much, and it'll clean up the graph. You need to push this apply button over here on the right. Now, once again, he's included his warm-up here, which complicates the job slightly. It's not impossible, though. We just have to find this heart rate where the heart rate stabilizes. So somewhere in here, it looks like after about 20 minutes into his workout, but you can see here early in early stages, the heart rate's climbing fairly quickly. So we certainly don't want to start collecting the data there. We want to wait until the heart rate is stabilized somewhere here in it looks like the high 120s. And once again, we're going to select and drag the cursor over what appears to be roughly half of the test. So there we see that his average heart rate over here is 133 for the first half. And over here we can see that the average heart rate is 141. So only an increase of roughly 8 beats. So that means that this one was done at a pace that's much more reasonable for him to use. That'll help him identify that pace for future training. And because we see that the difference in these two, the averages between the first half and the second half, being only 8 beats is actually less than 6%, so it's very close to the 5% that we look for. As a consequence, we would probably, we did tell this fellow that this is probably, pretty reflective of where his aerobic threshold is, high 120s to 130. Bear in mind that the aerobic threshold does move around from day to day based on recovery state, and it's not something that's cast in stone. Also, it's important to remember that this aerobic threshold heart rate will increase for many months if you're just beginning this type of training. And you'll see an improvement in both the aerobic threshold heart rate and the pace at that heart rate. Let's move on to another test. This test was done running outdoors on what we would consider a rolling terrain. I mean, this is the elevation. This gray stuff is the elevation gain and loss picked up by his altimeter in his watch, and it looks like it's crazy steep and really hilly. But if you go over here and look at the right, you'll see that this whole 6.8 mile run only had about 200 feet of gain and loss throughout the whole thing, and that definitely would qualify as gentle rolling terrain. Because this one was done outdoors, the GPS is accurate, or we assume its GPS is accurate, and we can see that here Training Peaks gives us this pace to heart rate calculation. It's 2.39. I wouldn't get too caught up in the kind of false precision of the second decimal place here. I don't think that's really important to us. What we can see though is that it's definitely less than 3%. So he was well under his aerobic threshold with his starting heart rate in here, which is somewhere in the let's call, we could easily say that's about 150 was probably what his target heart rate was when this athlete started. And so I'd feel pretty comfortable in telling this person that their aerobic threshold is somewhat higher than 150, because the drift over here, remember, it should be 5% ideally. The fact that he's still got some margin, he's operating at some margin below 5%, would indicate that he probably was a bit under his aerobic threshold. So I would say that if you had to make a guess rather than redo the test, I would say this person could use low 150s, 152, 153 as an aerobic threshold starting place for now. Lastly, I want to look at a test that was done on a running track. If you don't have access to good flat terrain, that's a wonderful way to do it. So here that you can see that this was a very well executed test because he collected data for only for the 1 hour of the duration of the test. Once again, you can kind of, this looks crazy because he's running on a flat surface, and so you wonder how in the heck did he get this much elevation gain. And this might indicate, if he had a barometric altimeter, that during the course of that hour there might have been a pressure change, and as a consequence it actually looks like he's changing elevation, but he's not. So let's look at the data here. We can see that he started in the kind of high 120s, probably had a 130 as a target heart rate. But because it's outdoors and it has a GPS, we can see that the pace to heart rate ratio here is 4.5% roughly. So almost dead on for declaring that was his aerobic threshold, and we could feel comfortable in saying, yeah, might as well just use about 130 as the upper limit of zone 2. So that's a look at how we conduct and then analyze the test. Hope this video has been helpful for you. Once again, refer to the more detailed description of the test in the article that's linked to below. And in one of the subsequent videos we'll be doing, we'll explain how to actually set up your zones in Training Peaks.